Hi everyone, this is week 2, video 2. Yesterday we spoke about inequality, how to measure it, and how generally the trend in major economies around the world has been to an increase in inequality over the last few decades. Today we're going to be looking at one of the drivers of this increase in inequality, namely the tax system, the role that it plays within income distribution. We'll briefly mention some others, but we'll largely get into the other drivers of inequality in tomorrow's discussion. So we'll save that for then. Okay, I'm just going to open up my slides here. Oh. And there we go. So let's see. So this is the table of contents that we'll be discussing today. It's largely all related to taxation and the role it plays in relation to inequality. The main parts will be focused around the results of Saez and Zuckman, a book that was published late last year that focuses on the US, that I think you'll find quite interesting in and of itself, but also in its relation to how it mirrors changes in the tax system in other economies around the world. We'll then, in the last part, just kind of consider some counter-arguments to the case that Saez and Zuckman bring, and we'll sum up with some policy implications. Okay. So what are the drivers of inequality? The inequality that we saw yesterday, what has been pushing it along and increasing it over time? Well, if you've done the reading already, which I hope you have, you'll see that the literature has found consensus on many factors. Globalization is a major one. How jobs are offshored and outsourced to developing low-wage countries in particular, the effects it has on demand and so on, has been shown to affect inequality in a big way. Financialization, we're going to actually dedicate a whole week to this topic, so I won't go into too much detail here. But you can kind of largely see this as how many non-financial corporations have been acting more in alignment with the motives and interests of the financial markets. So, for example, increasing share buybacks and focusing on the shareholder value rather than focusing on other stakeholders like employees and other parts of the economy. Technological progress is a big factor here with relation to inequality, especially when we see the likes of self-driving cars perhaps making the need for bus drivers and truck drivers, making it obsolete. Labor market institutions, so how powerful labor unions are, clearly has an effect on the wage that labor receives and employment to some extent. So, especially considering that most people are wage earners, we should find, or one would expect to find, that labor market institutions certainly have a large effect on inequality. The last 2 points we have here are relating to the firm's market power. So depending on how much competition a particular firm has, it may be able to, or we would expect it to be able to set up a higher markup on its base costs if there's less competition, and thereby, in some sense, extract more value from consumers who are largely wage earners, and thereby drive inequality. And lastly, here we have the point about government policy, especially after crises. And now this is particularly interesting as we're going through the coronavirus crisis at the moment. And it's still up in the air. No one really knows exactly how this is going to affect not only stability in the economy, but income distribution. So will all these different corporations be bailed out? And all the shareholders of those corporations be safe in some sense in their investments? Or will they take a big hit? That remains to be seen. Will wages continue to be subsidized? Or will governments stop at a certain point and cite other considerations or concerns, however valid they may be, for stopping such intervention? So in the last financial crisis, we saw the mass bailout of these banks, which certainly had implications for income distribution. Even quantitative easing, for example, has been found to have impacts on income distribution. And that's largely in response to crises. So government policy and how it spends money is especially interesting. But at the moment, we're going to look at how it kind of takes money, right? So we're going to be looking at taxation, how it distributes the tax, how it takes taxes and how it redistributes it afterwards. So to motivate the topic, here we have the pre-tax income distribution in Germany. So this is pre-tax, before any taxes are taken. So this is market-based. We have from 1980 to 2017. And we see in blue here is the bottom 50% of income earners, and in red, the top 10%. And in the market-based pre-tax measure, basically the top 10% for the period of analysis is higher than the bottom 50%. So that's already quite a stark a measure of inequality. But at the same time, we have systems in place to ensure that this kind of inequality doesn't get out of hand, right? That's what the tax system is supposedly there for. At least one of the roles is to ensure, that we have a favorable income distribution or a desirable one. So perhaps we should look at post-tax income distribution, which we have here, again with data from the World Incomes Database. Very useful data. And here we see, the change in there is a more pronounced change in distribution. At the beginning of the period of analysis in 1980, the bottom 50% had more than the top 10%. Now that's still unequal, you could say, but certainly less so than in the previous slide before tax. But this over time has swapped. Sometime around 2004, 2005, we see the reverse in fortunes. The top 10% now are taking a bigger slice of GDP or national income than the bottom 50%, even in post-tax terms. So that could reflect either, that market incomes are growing much faster at the top end of the distribution than the bottom, or that the tax system is becoming, less progressive. It's not redistributing as much as it used to. So we're going to kind of investigate this further. This is especially interesting considering, still today, although this is for 2010, still today, Germany has a progressive income tax, like most developed, if not all developed economies, where we see, depending on the taxable income, how much income you earn pre-tax, you have different marginal tax rates. So up to, say, maybe, 12,000 euro, you're not paying any tax. And then after that, until maybe 20,000 euro, you're paying a rate of 15, 16, up to 25%. And we see these tax brackets are clearly identified. And we see that the average tax is then a more continuous function of those marginal taxes, which are much more discrete, at least in the brackets that are applied. But the top marginal tax rate is 45%. So this is already one of those supposed, containers of inequality, right? The very fact that we tax different levels of income differently, or higher levels of income, we apply a higher rate of tax. So this should at least try to stop massive levels of inequality or limit its growth. But the first thing to take into consideration is, how does this top rate, which today is around 45%, how does that compare historically? Well, let's look at Germany, first off, here in green. And we see that, this current rate of 45% is relatively stable in Germany since the 1960s, but after the war it did go up above 80%, up to even, 90%, right? So it was higher in the past in Germany, but this is even sort of more the case in the United Kingdom and the United States, where it's not just immediately after World War II that we see these high income tax rates, or a high top marginal income tax rates, but in fact it goes all the way up into 1978 in the case of the UK, and in the US we have a rate of 70% up until 1981, up until Reagan comes, around when Reagan comes to power. France, like Germany, is a bit more stable over the long run. The US and the UK really exhibit this shift in how much they are taxing the top income earners. In the United Kingdom, we have a rate of up to 98%, even in 1978, which in today's modern world, even though it's a few decades later, is quite unheard of. Okay, so we can see that there has been this downward trend, and that is certainly playing a role in the post-tax distribution of incomes. Here we have similar data for other countries, not because here we only have 4. Now we have further major economies like South Korea, we had United Kingdom before, but Japan and so on. And we don't have as much data, but we have some data, at least data for 1979 and 2010. And we can see that in virtually every case, in fact, I think in every case, we have seen a drop in the top marginal income tax rate. So there's this shift in how politics is conducted or what is politically popular that enabled these sorts of statutory reforms to take place. And it seems to be widespread around the world. Some differences are much bigger, like see here we have Iran went from 90% to 35%. Some are a bit more modest, like Austria, the top rate fell from 62 to 50%. But the trend is clear. Downward, a lesser top marginal income tax rate over time. So that's one form of how perhaps our tax system is not combating inequality as much as it may have in the past. Another form is to acknowledge that there are other forms of taxation. There isn't just personal income tax. There's also payroll taxes, right? So how much you pay towards Social Security or national insurance in the UK or Medicare in the US, and various other like Solidaritätszuschlag and that sort of thing in Germany. These sorts of taxes that are taken away, in particular from wage earners, even before they even see the fruit of their labor, if you will. The third point here, consumption taxes. Well, these are all the taxes that are collected by sellers, in particular, in the form of VAT or excise duty and so on, and passed on to the government. So these are indirect taxes that aren't based on how much income you earn. They're simply based on whether or not you buy the product. And lastly, we have a group of taxes that we can call capital taxes. So here we could put corporate income tax, property tax, estate tax. So corporate income tax essentially is, the tax that corporations pay on profits that are often is taxes paid on profits that are distributed from corporations, so dividends and so on. Estate taxes, this is, depending on your political view, either a death tax or I think I've also seen it be called the Paris Hilton tax. It is essentially a tax that is levied after death of a very wealthy individual, where a certain amount of their total wealth is taxed. And exactly how wealthy you have to be for that to apply is, of course, like all these other taxes, dependent on which country you live in. And how easy it is to avoid these taxes is also dependent on which country you live in. But we can see from these groupings that there are some taxes that we could see as disproportionately affecting labor. So those are the payroll and consumption taxes. Now, why payroll and consumption? Well, payroll is obvious enough. You have a wage packet and a certain percentage of that is deducted before you even see it. Consumption taxes, maybe, if you haven't thought of this before, may require a bit more thinking because it's not immediately obvious. But the main idea is simply that, the poorer must pay a larger fraction of their income on basic goods for food and drink and sanitary goods and so on. They must pay a greater fraction of their income. So to the poor, consumption taxes matter a whole lot more than to the rich. So consumption taxes are inherently regressive, right? The poorer pay more than the rich in consumption tax as a fraction of their income, right? And then on the other hand, those taxes that affect capital, obviously capital taxes. Seeing as not many workers own corporations or own shares in corporations, and that not many workers have enough income or wealth to be even vaguely concerned about their estate tax. We can see that capital taxes are there primarily affects the wealthier. So we can kind of see how these other forms of taxation has changed over time to try and understand the effects of the tax system as a whole, the effect that the whole system has on income distribution. Here we have some data for developing economies in particular, again with great data from Our World in Data. And we can see some of the trends across the developing world. So let's say consumption taxes. This is like VAT and other sales taxes. These hurt the poor, the workers in particular, and we see that there's been a general increase at the end of the 20th century between these two dates. Corporate income taxes, a slight fall. We're going to go into corporate income taxes a lot more next week, but generally we'll see that the general trend has very much been to fall. So from these two measures alone, we see that inequality is already being, exacerbated, is being worsened. Excise taxes, like consumption taxes, we can see there's not much change here. Personal income taxes, well, it depends on what kind of personal income taxes and how they're distributed. And Social Security, well, this again is like payroll taxes. So any increase is likely to affect or worsen inequality. And we see there is, a very minor increase. But the changes we see here are not in the interest of better equality. They, in fact, worsen inequality, what we've seen in this chart at least. So the second part of this lecture, I'd like to go into the case of the US in a lot more detail. In particular because there's this fantastic book that came out at the end of last year by Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, two French economists now at the University of California, Berkeley, who have studied the history of the US, its taxation, how it's evolved over time, and have some data that I think is especially relevant to our discussion on inequality and how the tax system plays a role. Okay, so to most people who have any idea about taxes in the US, they would think that the US tax system is progressive, based on the idea that, income is taxed in a progressive way. Just like in Germany, as we saw earlier, the marginal tax rate increases as your income increases, leading to an average tax rate that is increasing, more or less continuously over the taxable income. So in the US, the top marginal tax rate is lower than in Germany. It's, in fact, around 39.5% or something like that. But on the whole, it looks progressive, right? But as we saw earlier, income tax is simply one of many kinds of taxes. And so we have to consider these other taxes if we want to get a picture of how progressive the overall tax system is. Once we take into consideration the fact that consumption taxes are regressive in nature, as opposed to income tax, which is progressive, right? So let's compare. Let's take into consideration those other taxes. Well, this is one of the main purposes of the book by Saez and Zucman. One of the main findings is that once you take into consideration these other taxes, you get a tax system that is, on the whole, very much a flat system. So as incomes increase, which we see here we have the poorest 10%, the next poorest 10%, up into, let's say, here we have the second richest 10%, and then we're differentiating finer and finer as we get to the top of the income distribution. And why do we do that? Well, because those at the top earn a greater fraction of national income. So it in some sense is highly relevant to understand how much these people are paying, considering how important they are in the income distribution, right? So what we see is no matter where you fall in the income distribution, your tax rate is very similar. It's more or less around 28%. Yeah, there are some deviations, but this is, considering the variation here, quite an overall flat system. What's especially interesting is that you can have the poorest people in society here in the bottom 10th, in the bottom decile, who are paying perhaps more tax on average than people here in, say, the lower middle class or in the upper working class, depending on how you want to define it. And in fact, they're paying more than what Sayers and Zuckman find are the top 400% income earners, right? So overall, there's the impression of flatness, but it gets somewhat oddly regressive very suddenly at the end here. And we're going to delve now a bit into why this is. This already is the first result, namely that the system as a whole is not progressive. But then we get into a little bit more detail on why or how this could be the case. Okay, so here we see, here on the outside, where I'm moving the cursor now, this is essentially this curve that we saw here, the average tax rates that each decile pay, part of the distribution pay. And now we're just seeing the composition, basically, of the taxes. So as we would expect, the consumption tax is very relevant for the poor in society. And as you get richer, consumption taxes take up a smaller and smaller proportion of your income. Corporate and property taxes, so these kinds of capital taxes, on the other hand, have the opposite effect, as we would expect. Not many poor people have anything to do with holding shares in companies and so on, may not own much properties, so it makes up a small fraction here and a relatively large percentage here. Payroll taxes, we see, are very important to the poorest in society. It eats up a good, what's that, 10, 15%, or 10% of income for the poorest in society. And of course, given that the richest are not, or typically are not on payroll, they are not taxed in the same way. And that's an important thing to take into consideration here. In the US, payroll taxes are capped, such that if you're earning more than a certain value, let's say 100,000, I can't quite remember the figure now, but let's say 100,000, then that is the top amount to which any payroll tax can apply. So that's another reason why payroll taxes simply begin to vanish at the upper end of the distribution. Even if the richest are on payroll, their contributions are capped by law. And lastly, then we have the individual income taxes. Now, this again applies more as you get richer, as we would expect, given what we saw in the previous, or one of the previous graphs. But it doesn't quite do enough to completely offset what we see in these payroll and consumption taxes, so that we end up with what is quite a flat distribution, all considered. The estate tax does very little in the end in terms of actual amount of tax paid as a fraction of total income to the distribution. And this can be due to various things, evasion and avoidance, as we will see, but also, well, yeah, the lowering of the estate tax over time has contributed to its minor role in effect. Okay, so that's the composition of all taxes. But let's get into a little bit more detail on why certain taxes are more relevant to others and how these taxes in particular have changed over time. So, first question, how are the poor paying so much? Well, we can consider the collapse in minimum wage as an important determinant. Why? Well, because the amount of tax you pay as a fraction of income is also dependent on your income. So if your income has fallen and your amount of tax paid remains around the same, then that means, well, that your average tax rate is increasing, right? So here we have some data on this particular variable. So if you're earning minimum wage on a in a full-time position in 1950, then that minimum wage would amount to 50% of the average national income in 1950. So, you weren't quite at the average, but you weren't too far off, at least not compared to 2019, where a similar setup would leave you in the bottom 20%, right? So this is the changes in the minimum wage, not keeping up with changes in the income distribution. So the minimum wage has not been able to keep up. So we've also seen at the same time the rise of payroll taxes. This was a minor consideration in 1950 at 3% of total income. In 2019, it's grown fivefold to 15%. So a massive stake, massive increase. And we've also had the growth of consumption taxes. Today, they account for about 10% of the income for the poor and 1 to 2% for the richer. So they're very relevant for the poor, as we saw. Important point to keep in mind here is that consumption taxes are often on goods and goods alone, and not on services. And given that the poor generally tend to use up most of their income on goods and not services, and for rich people it is a greater fraction of their income used on services, going to the opera or perhaps getting legal advice and so on, accounting services, whatever it may be. You're not being taxed on these services through consumption taxes. And also excise duties are especially hard-hitting for the poor. So if you must drive to work and you're paying excise duty implicitly on fuel, then that's going to eat up a lot of your income. Also, if you're if you're a smoker, if you drink, then the high excise duties, which are sometimes used to try to nudge people off these things, can actually just kind of doubly punish them for whatever habit they have. So these can be particularly relevant for the poor and why they remain poor. On the other side of the coin, if you like, is the question, how are the rich paying so little? Well, as we've seen, where we've got a less progressive marginal income tax than before, corporate tax rates have been vanishing, as we will go into much more detail on next week. But we also have just legal exemptions which generally benefit the rich. So, for example, profits of a corporation which are left undistributed count towards someone's wealth, but are not taxed. If they're not distributed, they're not taxed, essentially, in the US, as in many other countries. This, is important in the sense that, well, it affects their wealth, and so they can use that as perhaps, collateral or basis on which to get a loan. But at the same time, it's still not taxed. We've also seen, just simply lower taxes on capital, quite explicitly. So, for example, dividends, when they are paid, are only taxed at 20%. And we've seen falling estate taxes as well. In 1976, a rate of 77% was applied after death of the wealthiest, and now that's down to 40%. Since 2018, enacted in Trump's tax plan, we've seen a 20% deduction for business income, so the income of businesses that are not corporations, that are of a sufficient size. We won't get into the details, but essentially the deduction has meant that those business owners of a certain size are now facing much lower marginal tax rates than even the highest wage earners. And since the 1980s, as Sayers and Zuckman detail in at great length, we've seen the rise of tax avoidance and evasion, where tax avoidance is technically legal and evasion is illegal. But we'll get into a little bit on that a bit later. So all of these different considerations lead to what I find a very interesting chart, which is the overall progressivity, if you like, of the tax system over time. This again is data. The data is from Sayers and Zuckman. I've just displayed it here in an interactive way so we can see over time. But in 1950, we see a remarkably progressive tax system in the US, as like in many other countries around the world. The top income earners, the top 400 richest in the US were paying a tax rate of 70% on average, right? The bottom of the distribution were paying 16%. And this is partly in response to the war and paying for it, but it's also very much a political shift, as is explored in greater detail in Sayers and Zuckman. So this sort of ideology behind it is very different than simply, how do we pay for the war? there is an acceptance that there is such a thing as excessive income, that there is a politically undesirable or even economically undesirable level of top wealth in society beyond which perhaps no one should go if we are to avoid the opulence of the roaring 20s and the robber barons and the Rockefellers and the Morgans and so on, who essentially kind of captured markets with their excessive wealth and power. So this is Roosevelt in particular, essentially trying to limit this, what he calls excessive wealth. And then we see over time, like in the 1960s, still quite progressive, but it's changing. 1970, not much change. 1980, already quite a big change. And then as we get closer to today, ready by 2000, we have a progressive system, but now it ranges between 24% and 33%. So there's not much difference between bottom and top. And then in 2010, again, the gap has narrowed even further, 25 and 27. And then we're left with the graph that we saw earlier. It looks a bit skewed here because we've zoomed in, but it's essentially the same thing, where the top 400 income earners are now essentially paying less than the bottom 10% of income earners in average rate of tax.